I'm a school committee member, and I just want to start by trying to frame this conversation. I'm really excited about this conversation. I think it's great that we're having this conversation. I think it's moving in the right direction. And it's fun to say those words because it's a tough time, I think, to talk about education nationally and locally. I think that, as we all know, there's strife between the administration / school committee and the Brookline Educators Union. There is a lot of difficulty for students coming out of a year of hybrid learning. There are social and emotional learning difficulties that resulted from that. But this conversation on literacy and literacy instruction, I think, is moving in the right direction. And there's a lot of openness and thoughtfulness and intelligence on this issue among every stakeholder group in Brookline. So I just want to start by saying that this is a conversation that I feel like I'm thrilled to be participating in it all. I also want to say there's a policy window opening at Brookline on literacy instruction. This is, I think, the third forum that the BPO has held on literacy. The curriculum subcommittee, which I'm on, has previously docketed literacy instruction and received a presentation from the administration on it. There's a lot of openness at the Office of Teaching and Learning on what are good literacy instructional practices and what are practices aligned with the evidence. And I think at the school level, literacy specialists are doing a great job these days. They've introduced the Wilson Reading System through Foundations, which has phonics and Orton-Gillingham principles embedded in it. There's a lot to be proud of. At the same time, I think we haven't done all the work we need to do to identify the resources, tools, and even the pedagogies that are not research aligned, which I think sometimes still leads to contradictory and confusing classroom experiences. I also want to say that I think getting literacy right is the foundation, not just of learning excellence, but also of equity. I think it's the kind of gaps that start when there are differential outcomes in reading and writing that get wider and wider and persist as students progress throughout the educational system. So it's a major effort when you're aligning literacy instructional practices with the evidence to get the equity issue right also. I'm interested in this. This issue is what got me interested in education in Brookline. One of my daughters is dyslexic. She worked with the 3 cueing system in kindergarten. She developed a lot of techniques that allowed her to disguise her difficulty with phonics. It took a long time for us to figure out that she was having difficulty with phonics. I saw firsthand what evidence unaligned practices can do to your own kid. And that's a hard experience for a parent. And I think there are probably a lot of parents on here who felt the same way. Certainly when I ran for school committee, a lot of parents shared similar stories with me. I also read Emily Hanford's At a Loss for Words when I was struggling to figure out how to support my daughter. And it was like a light bulb went on. She described the specific experience my daughter was going through. And that led me to start to look at, well, what are the evidence bases for literacy? I already was familiar with them in my work in international educational development, but I hadn't tried to apply them to Brookline. So I found communities around this. Like there have been lectures and webinars titled things like Making the Case for a Break with the Reading Workshop Towards Evidence-Aligned Literacy Instruction. Then the Ed Reports analyses of Lucy Calkins's Units of Reading, Units of Writing, and Fountas of Pinnell work came out in September and October of this year and slammed a lot of that work as not being, as failing our students, as producing results that are far beneath what parents and communities should expect. So I think, just to sum up, this is an opportune time to talk about literacy. It's also, I think, a time where we can not only hear from some of the experts in literacy nationally who happen to live in Brookline, who you'll meet, but also think about how that evidence can be applied in Brookline. Because this policy window is open, I think we can make change where change is warranted and needed. So that's my introduction. I hope I didn't ramble too much. I want to introduce our panel moderator, Dinan Messiqua, who's worked in the field of language-based learning disabilities for over 20 years. She's in private practice. She coaches parents on how to navigate through the complexities of special education. She consults with teachers and school administrators in Boston about early literacy instruction. And prior to this, Dinan was a special educator in Brookline, and she worked on a district-wide language-based program that coached general education teachers. at the Carroll School in Lincoln, Massachusetts. She was a middle school language arts teacher and an Orton Gillingham tutor. She's the president of the board for the Massachusetts branch of the International Dyslexia Association. And she's got an MA in child development from Tufts. And she's got an MED from Lesley with a licensure in moderate special needs. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dinan.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for that introduction. So I just want to say that we are thrilled to have you all here tonight to listen to our panelists. And I'm really excited that I get to, and feel very privileged that I get to introduce the panelists. Our first speaker is going to be Dr. Ola Ozernov-Palchik. She is a program director and lecturer for the Mind, Brain, and Education Master's Program at Harvard Graduate School of Education. She's also a postdoctoral scientist at the McGovern Institute for Brain and Research at MIT. And she applies neuroimaging, psychoeducational, and intervention methods to investigating typical and atypical language and reading development. In addition to studying the reading brain, Ola conducted literacy assessments, and she received her PhD in cognitive science and child development from Tufts University. Ola also has advocated for early identification of dyslexia risk, and her work has helped advance the passage of legislation, very recent legislation in Massachusetts, focused on literacy screening, which is so exciting. Ola has authored multiple publications on the topic of reading in leading journals and has been invited to present on the topic both nationally and internationally. She is a recent recipient of the International Dyslexia Association Early Career Researcher Award for contributions to research. So we are so excited to have Ola with us tonight, and she's a parent of children in the Brookline Public Schools. So it's incredible the people that we have in Brookline. Our second speaker is Miriam Fein. Miriam is a speech and language pathologist and a reading specialist with 20 years of experience across multiple grade levels in both public and private educational settings. As a learning specialist for the organization Gateways, Access to Jewish Education, Miriam currently works with students and teachers at Maimonides School in Brookline. She is also on the tutoring team at Brimmer and May and works directly with children and families in her private practice in Brookline. With her training in explicit, systematic methods of teaching, reading, and writing, and her understanding of the relationship between oral language and written language, which is so key, she helps students grow as readers, writers, and learners. She is a strong advocate for evidence-informed educational practices and loves sharing her passion for language and literacy with students and colleagues. So in just a sec, I'm going to hand it over to Ola, and then Miriam will speak after Ola. And then after that, there will be a question and answer session. So what I'm going to ask you, our audience, to do is, if you have questions at any point during this webinar, please put them in the Q&A, which is at the bottom of your screen. I'm going to be looking at all the questions, organizing the questions, and then at the end of Miriam's talk, we will ask our panelists the questions. We are so looking forward to Ola's presentation. So now I'm going to pass it on to Ola.
Thanks very much. I'm going to share my screen. Great. And wonderful. Okay, so everyone can see the screen well. Guess everyone turned off their cameras, but I'm hoping it's working. Okay, so thank you so much for this wonderful introduction. And I'm really, really excited to be here and give a talk in our own community. So as the title says, today we'll be talking about the science of reading, or more precisely, the science of reading comprehension, which is, the ultimate goal of reading. Reading comprehension is a very complex cognitive task. And in fact, at the turn of a century, a pioneer in reading research said that to study reading comprehension is to study the very many of the most intricate workings of the human mind. And it is a task that takes children years of learning to master, and only about 30% of our nation's children have mastered it. And here are the results from the nation's report card for Massachusetts. And so you can see that, you know, we are doing roughly the same. So in the blue here, you see the basic reading levels of children, and in orange, you see the proficient, the percent of children who had proficient reading level. And this is the fourth graders in Massachusetts. And what is really striking about these results is not only the fact that, you know, we don't have 100% of children who are reading at proficient level, but also the gaps we see between children, for example, white children and children of color, as well as children from higher and lower socioeconomical status. And these gaps have been stable in our nation for the past 30 years. And in fact, in the past few years, there's been an increase in these gaps. And we know that these disparities in education have mirrored the disparities in wealth, employment, and virtually all other indicators of health and well-being. Reading is fundamental to lifelong learning and opportunity for all children. In fact, you know, Frederick Douglass said, once you learn to read, you will be free forever. So, you know, learning to read is really just about a human right, and it's directly related, as Steven said, to issues of equity. So, this is sort of the importance of reading, just to frame our conversation today. Okay, so I'm going to give you a moment to read this passage. So this is an excerpt from a book, okay? And some of us reading this excerpt may linger on this made up word and try to pronounce it in our head, so try to decode it. Others who read Harry Potter will recognize this as one of the passage from one of the books, right? And will immediately recognize the term and just sort of read it like by sight. Yet others, some of us who are well-read, this may invoke some imagery from Joan of Arc. And some of us who are in Massachusetts, this may remind us of a recent trip to Salem, okay? So we all differ in how we process passages, and we all differ in how we comprehend the same text. And in fact, there's mounting evidence that if we were to measure people's performance across reading comprehension tasks, this performance would be largely explained by how accurately we read words, accurately and fluently we identify words. So this is decoding skills, and I'm going to continue to mention this term. And how well we can comprehend linguistic information, so just oral language, if measured by listening comprehension test, for example. Of course, each of these components involves multiple cognitive and perceptual processes. So word recognition involves mapping letters to speech, so phonology to orthography. And also in advanced readers, it also involves reading more quickly to meaning. So we have this path from letters to sounds to meaning. Language comprehension also involves the knowledge of vocabulary, having background knowledge, the ability to inference from the passages we read, understanding the language structure, the grammar of our language, as well as multi-domain functions. And here I mean things, you know, like working memory or ability to attend to the things you read. What is important to understand is that reading comprehension does not occur if one of these components are missing. So you can't comprehend what you're reading if you're not able to identify the words. And you can't comprehend what you're reading if you don't know the language. So if you can decode the words on the page, but you have like zero vocabulary, okay? And of course, all of these components interact with each other and inform each other. So if you have good word recognition skills, your language comprehension will be better. If you have strong language comprehension skills, it will help you learn how to read better. So even though we vary in our abilities in these various components of reading comprehension, we all learn to read and following a very similar journey. Okay, and we can roughly divide this journey into 3 stages: a pre-reading stage, when the focus is on learning spoken language, a decoding stage when the focus is on mapping the language to print, and the fluency stage when this focus is on gaining automaticity in word recognition and further developing your comprehension skills. By the time children begin to learn to read, they usually already have relatively sophisticated spoken language skills, such as knowledge of the meanings of many words. how do children acquire this linguistic knowledge? So here in red is our language system. There's quite a bit of debate, whether or not we are born with a language system or we're born with sort of the apparatus to support a very easy and natural development of language. But we do know that, language development occurs effortlessly. So it almost cannot be prevented if a child is exposed to a rich language environment. And, recent studies, so this is a study from macaques, so like monkeys who were inside the brain camera, and they looked at faces of other monkeys, making facial expressions. It was shown that they activated very similar regions as the ones we activate for a language, so the ones here in red, and thinking that maybe those regions actually support social cognition in other primates, and in our brains it evolved to support language. I can't even begin to think what a study in little monkeys who are in the scanner not sedated would look like. That sort of puts my child studies in perspective. But I think those are really interesting findings to show us that, again, the apparatus for our language system is innate and sort of has an evolutionary basis. So, language acquisition happens effortlessly and implicitly. So almost magically, babies are, the smart statisticians who use statistical patterns in the language to hear and to learn the sounds of their own language, the rhythm of their own language, like where the boundaries of their speech goes, words and their meanings, grammar, etc. So to illustrate how babies would do this, I need the volunteer. If somebody can sort of, Steven, if you could volunteer and unmute yourself for a second. Thank you.
Hello.
Okay, so let's say Steven is a child and, and he's walking with me in a grocery store and he hears me refer to this object as tufa. And then, we pass by another aisle and I refer to this object as tufa. So then I'm going to ask Steven, is this a tufa?
No.
Is this a tufa?
Yes.
Is this a tufa?
Yes.
Is this a tufa?
No.
Thank you, Steven. And so what happened is really remarkable. So this is to demonstrate how very quickly we can learn, generalize from different patterns in our visual stimuli or in the language stimuli, and and create and learn a category about objects in our world, right? So imagine that instead of showing a tufa, I showed Steven a dog, so I showed him a corgi, and then I showed him a bulldog, and then we saw a greyhound pass on the street. And usually a child, they've never seen all possible categories of dogs, they'll be able to identify that as a dog. So this was a very implicit and very fast learning. So I can't ask Steven, what exactly are the properties of the tufas that you generalized from? It just happened almost without his awareness. So oral language, serves the foundation for reading acquisition, right? So therefore, reading development doesn't start at in kindergarten or as children start attending school. It starts as early as in utero with repeated exposure to this low-pass, filtered and muffled sounds of the language that the child will hear in their mother's bellies, right? And newborn at 2 days already show preference for their native language versus a foreign language and the preference for their mother's voice. By 6 months of age, infants consistently able to distinguish the speech sounds of their native language from those of the other languages. So this ability to recognize and distinguish among the sounds of language are called phonological processing. So during this first few years of life, children are able to learn the sounds of the structures of the language, to produce speech, to learn some vocabulary. And they start noticing print around them, right? So they might be riding in the car and they saw the McDonald's sign and they're able to know that this is McDonald's, right? This corresponds to McDonald's. They start to develop attitudes and beliefs around literacy. So, they may associate, being read to something warm and fuzzy when they're, sitting next to their guardian on the couch, drinking hot cocoa and being read to, right? Or they may be able to already start looking at pictures in books. They already create some sort of beliefs and attitudes about reading. So then when children start to attend school and start to receive explicit instruction, and I'm going to pause here for a minute just to explain that, we have those stages, but they don't necessarily occur linearly, nor do they correspond to a specific timeline, right? So this is very rough, right? So, the transition from pre-reading to reading stage occurs at different ages for different children. But here I'm going to just assume that the child was not exposed to reading instruction before they start the first day of kindergarten. So let's say in the first day of kindergarten, children are beginning to be taught to associate that the speech sounds that they learned in their language are associated with those squiggles on the page, right? So they learn to associate that symbols that they see in books represent sounds. And this is, they start to learn what we call the alphabetic principle. And this has to happen through explicit instruction. There was an experiment, for example, with preschool children, and children were taught to read aloud pairs of written words, for example, fat and bat. And then they were asked to read words they haven't seen yet. So they wanted to see whether this knowledge from, being taught some words will generalize to other words they've never seen. There's a transfer of knowledge, like Steven demonstrated with learning the tufas, right? And virtually none of the 80 children succeeded in the transfer task. So they were not just able to sort of extract that information that being explicitly taught, that their sounds of language in a very explicit and specific manner correspond to the squiggles, the print letters on the page. So when left to their own devices, children show no evidence of being able to induce the alphabetic principle without explicit instruction. So to crack the alphabetic code, children must be able to abstract the relevant phonemic units from the stream of the speech they hear and learn how to manipulate these units. And they must learn the symbols of the writing system that correspond to those units, the phonemes. And once the children acquire the alphabetic principle, they can move to learning the specifics of the relationship between graphemes and phonemes, again, the letters and the speech sounds in the writing system, and to apply this knowledge in their reading and writing. And it's important because, even if the children are very good decoders, they still need to continue to learn and understand the structure and this, this phonemic awareness principles in order to inform their spelling. Okay, so the spelling actually helps contributes as well to this knowledge of phonemes. And it is important to understand there's a close and reciprocal association among children's letter knowledge skills, their phonemic awareness, and their skills in alphabetic decoding. So one in the knowledge of one informs the knowledge of the other. Okay, sorry, and I need Steven again for just a second. Thank you. Okay. So I'm going to try to illustrate the process of learning alphabetic code. Yeah. Could you hear that?
I think so.
Okay. I can play it again if.
Yeah. Do you want me to repeat that? No. Okay.
Did you get that? So what is this word?
God.
God, yes. So, this was a different process from learning the tufas, right? So we had to sort of explicitly teach Steven the sounds and the letters. And in fact, I'm sure if I show him, these squiggles again in a few slides, he might not remember them. Or if, the word was much longer, it would be a much more challenging task. So thank you, Steven. So this is basically how we teach the children to associate speech sounds to new orthographies, right? They know the speech sounds, they don't know the squiggles on the page. So once the children master the alphabetic principle, their reading becomes more automatic and fluent. So fluent reading allows increased focus on comprehension. And through reading, children start building their vocabulary, their background knowledge, content knowledge, cognitive abilities. So basically, children transition from learning to read to reading to learn. So now reading plays a crucial role across all the different other domains that they're learning in school: history, social studies, math, etc. And to illustrate how important reading is for learning, in one study, researchers monitored how much children read outside of school. So those are fifth graders. And basically, based on how much children reported spending reading per day, they estimated the number of words that the children would have been exposed to over a year. So those at the 10th percentile of reading skills. So basically that means that 90% of their peers read better than them. So there were 10th percentile reading skills, read 60,000 words a year. Those at the 50th percentile read 900,000 words a year. And those at the 90th percentile read 4 million words a year. In fact, students at the 90th percentile may read as many words in 3 days as a child in the 10th percentile read in an entire year outside of school. So these differences in exposure have cumulative effect on reading ability over time. With researcher Keith Stanovich called the Matthew effect of reading, where the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. So children who read the 90th percentile are not only exposed to words, they're exposed to tremendous amounts of knowledge, right? And background information and amazing, interesting ideas and vocabulary, etc. So exposed to so much more than children who are reading 60,000 words a year. Okay, so now we talked about how we learn to read. Let's pause and ask ourselves, how did humans develop this remarkable capacity? After all, reading is a recent human invention. It's really recent in their evolution, and it's basically, we don't have reading brains because we didn't give evolution enough time to create those reading brains. And what happens is that reading has to create its own niche by modifying pre-existing brain regions that evolved for different functions and repurpose those regions for reading. So it's basically like a mini evolution happening within each child as they learn how to read through schooling. So this is our brain. You sort of look at it from the left. So you can see I put the eyeballs here just for, illustration. This is the back of the brain. This is the front of the brain. And this is what the brain looks like when they read one word. And you can see how much of the brain is activating to support reading just one word. And you can also see how quickly this process happens. So this is like a live recording, right? It really happens on a millisecond basis in an automatic, fluent reading brain. So now this is like a little caricature of the reading brain, just to sort of zoom in and pause this picture. And what it shows us is basically all the different systems that we are born with. So we're born with a system that processes visual stimuli. We're born with a system that has access to meaning, right? The oral language system. We have our phonological system, our ability to produce speech sounds. So all of those brain regions we're already born with, right? And the only region that sort of that is different when we learn how to read is this region in red. And just to illustrate here is a picture of my oldest son reading a book to his brother. And basically they're looking at the same book, right? And they're both seeing pictures. So their visual cortex is activating, the here in blue, and they're both sort of listening to the speech, as they're reading. The baby hears the speech sound, so his speech network is activating, he's paying attention, right? And then for my oldest, he's pronouncing, articulating words, so his orange system is also working. So all of those regions are pretty much similar in both of their brains, except this red region, which is what we call the visual word form area, is activating in my older son because he knows how to read, but not in his baby brother. So this region is not yet activating at all. And this brain region, it's really just a region in the baby. It's just a region that supports object identification, right? So he's learning to identify pictures through similar regions here. Oops, sorry. It's a similar region to, it's in the same neighborhood as the regions that we identify faces through. It's basically a region that sort of has the capacity to develop visual expertise for things. So in bird watchers, this region would be really sort of fine-tuned to identify the different properties of birds, but not in people who, like me, who really just, cannot distinguish between birds at all. And so this region, because of, its zip code, because it's located in its privileged connections with the language regions and the phonological regions, is sort of really nicely positioned to become specialized for automatic identification of words. So in adult readers, this region identifies words as automatically as we identify faces. In fact, like most of us seeing a word cannot just not read it, right? Some other properties of this region is, that happen, the perceptual expertise, the word identification, becomes really, really fast. So basically 250 millisecond resolution from viewing a word. Again, just to illustrate, it's modality specific. So this region is active for print, but not for sounds. It is insensitive to variance. So, we read this as cat, right? So even though the A is capital, so we can still identify this word. But it learns structural regularities. So unlike faces, you're able to see me this way. I'm still the same person if I'm looking away, right? Or if I'm looking down. With letters, the letters meaning actually changes, right? From this to this. And so this actually is something that we need to learn and develop, again, a perceptual expertise for, that these two letters are not the same. And this is why in young readers, you often see this confusion, right? That they tend to confuse letters, especially when they write them. And this is where sort of this dyslexia myth that dyslexia is associated with letter reversal comes from. It's not a special property of being a dyslexic individual. It's basically just a property of not still having your perceptual fine-tuning of your visual word form area. Again, all of which will happen with explicit reading instruction. So basically with explicit reading instruction, you sort of, connect your visual system onto your language system. So that has to happen. Okay, so we talked about the components of reading comprehension, and we presented it this way, but we can also look at it as this sort of an equation, which is called the simple view of reading, that Miriam is going to talk about it some more. And in this equation, it's reading comprehension is a product, we have to multiply decoding and language comprehension to have reading comprehension. And the fact that this is a product means that if you have lower decoding skills, lower word identification skills, your reading comprehension is also going to be lower, right? If you have a 0, your reading comprehension is going to be a 0. And so this, low reading word identification skills is what we otherwise called developmental dyslexia, which is an impaired single word decoding skills. It's a selective deficit in word level processes, so inaccurately or fluently identifying words. It falls under the umbrella of other reading related deficits, but a deficit considered to be specific to single words. It is prevalent. It affects about 5 to 10% of all children. It is persistent. So most children who are poor readers in second grade will be poor readers at the end of high school without intervention, if they don't receive an appropriate intervention. It is hereditary. So children who are have a first degree relative, a sibling or a parent with dyslexia are 40 to 60% more likely to develop dyslexia themselves, which is really high. And it is neurobiological. So it affects that reading system that I showed you earlier, right? Specifically, and actually I'm going to talk about it a little bit more later, but if you look at the brains of individuals with dyslexia, adults with dyslexia, you see that they have reduced gray matter volume, which is sort of the number of the brain cells you have, but and you also have hypoactivation, so reduced activation during reading tasks. So basically their brains are a bit different. And here you can also see those are the white matter pathways that are basically connecting those regions within the reading network, right? And so those are connections, and those are the regions that wire the reading network together. Okay, and so you can think about these pathways as like electrical wiring system that pass the signal from one region in the brain to another region in the brain. And in dyslexia, this wiring is less insulated. So the passing of the electric signals is less efficient. There's sort of more of a leakage along the way. Okay. A big question is you may ask yourselves, right? So I told you that the reading brain is created through the experience of learning to read. Is whether those differences we see in the brains of individuals with dyslexia, is that a result of reading failure? So, if you read so much, so fewer words for many, many years, you just have less experiential effects on your brain. So the brain becomes as specialized. Or are those differences predate reading failure? So they could be causal to reading failure, suggesting that, dyslexia as a sort of a phenotype emerges as early as in utero, right? And this question is also important because if we know that the brains are different early on, before reading failure occurs, we can identify children early. And it is important because, as I mentioned, dyslexia is persistent. So 74% of children who don't learn to read by the end of 3rd grade will likely remain poor readers at high school and beyond. Okay, so they don't just catch up without appropriate intervention skills. And what we know about interventions is that interventions are most effective in those early, kindergarten, even preschool. So basically, you sort of get more for your buck in terms of interventions early on in reading development. You have greater gains in reading skills for sort of fewer hours spent instructing the child. But the paradox here is that diagnosis of dyslexia usually doesn't happen later on in about 3rd or 4th grade, because this is where we expect the child to know how to read. This is where this transition from learning to read to reading to learn happens, right? And so then we look at the child and we see that he's not reading yet and something is wrong. And then we sort of, refer them to assessments and diagnosis, et cetera, and start intervening. And at this point, interventions are not as effective. But how could we identify dyslexia before the symptom of reading failure occurs? So it turns out that we have some skills that or some tools that can help us identify children who are being at risk early on, as early as first few months of kindergarten, fairly reliable. So what are those measures? So first measure is letter sound knowledge. If your child, is having difficulty learning the sounds that are associated with letters, or even learning the names associated with letters, there might be at the greater risk for having reading difficulties later on. Another measure is phonological awareness and memory. Again, this realization that speech sounds are made out of smaller units. So, for example, being able to say that cat is cat. It's a phonological awareness skill, or remembering non-words, keeping non-words in memory and repeating them back. Another measure is rapid automatized naming. This is an example. This is where you ask a child to name the symbols on the page. Those are repeating symbols. It could be colors, it could be letters, it could be objects, as quickly as possible. It's a very reliable predictor of fluency, of reading fluency. And finally, measures such as expressive or receptive vocabulary, as well as other oral language measures, can help us see if children also have potential difficulties with their language skills. That could either be a predictor of dyslexia or potentially a developmental language disorder, so deficits in their oral language. Okay, so, to address the question of whether we can see brain differences as early as kindergarten before reading failure, and also to see whether those measures are in fact stably predictive of reading outcomes, we conducted a longitudinal study in Massachusetts. This is in collaboration with Dr. Nadine Gabb, who used to be at Boston Children's Hospital, and John Gabriele at MIT. So we went to 21 schools in New England. We tested about 1,200 students. And we administered a 25-minute battery of these assessments I showed you before to children the first month of kindergarten. And then we invited a subset of these children to come into MIT, and we conducted neuroimaging with them. So we, they lay inside an fMRI scanner, and they played some games. Again, I would have to give a much longer talk of how I got kindergarten children to lie still inside an MRI scanner for 45 minutes, but we did it successfully, and we got some neuroimaging data on about 180 children. And then we followed these children behaviorally until the end of 2nd grade, when the diagnosis of dyslexia can be made. So what did we find? So first of all, we found that risk looks different in different children. So we used a data-driven approach to identify distinct subgroups of performance on our measures, pre-literacy measures. And we found that there are 6 distinct groups. Okay, so one group was the average performers, we had the high performer group, and we had 4 risk groups. And strikingly, there was 100% stability in group membership when we followed up on these children 2 years later. So when we look at these children in depth and across time, we found interesting patterns in their profiles. The 2 of the risk profiles in yellow and in green were overrepresented in schools with high percentage of free reduced lunch eligibility, so schools with lower SES status, low socioeconomic status. In one risk profile here in red, children demonstrated difficulties in oral language. We looked at them again 2 years later. And in this profile in and this profile in blue. This is the profile that we saw of the children showed us a profile of developmental dyslexia. They really had persistent reading difficulties 2 years later. And so these is a picture of those profiles again 2 years later. And I'm happy in Q&A to show you those profiles in greater depth and talk about them some more. But I think the take-home message here, there was 100% stability in membership in this profile. So children who were in this blue profile remained in this blue profile 2 years later. So, and when we looked at their brains, the brains of those children, again, in kindergarten, we found the children who were the phonological risk, right, that showed poor phonological performance, had reduced fractional anisotropy, which means basically the conductivity of, increased sort of leakage, right? So, or reduced insulation of this white matter pathway that supports the phonological system, that connects this phonological system we talked about. So again, as early as kindergarten. Okay, so this is a child, it was also smaller in children who had poor phonological skills. So this is a child who scored a 0 in a phonological assessment. This is their arcuate fasciculus, their pathway. And this is a child who scored a 10, so it's much bigger. Okay, so the suggested structural basis of behavioral risk for dyslexia predates reading instruction. So it's not that it's a result of failing to read, that those structural brain differences are already there in the first few months of kindergarten. We also then were interested to look at, as I mentioned, some of the profiles were more prevalent in schools that had higher free reduced lunch eligibility. And in fact, I showed you before too that we have really huge gaps in reading performance in children from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, in children with higher socioeconomic backgrounds. So we compared those white matter pathways, again, that are important for reading. And this is a pathway that passes in this visual word form area. In children who's had higher versus whose mothers had more versus fewer years of maternal education. And we found that there were similar differences. So basically there was sort of reduced fractional anisotropy, again, this sort of, reduced insulation of this white matter pathway in children whose mothers had fewer years of maternal education. And the maternal education is considered a very reliable correlate of socioeconomic status, a really reliable measure. And these differences remained significant even after we controlled for parental reading history. So it's not just because, the mothers who had fewer years of maternal education was also mothers who had, for example, dyslexia growing up themselves. It was really about factors associated with being raised in a lower socioeconomic environment, somehow affect the connectivity patterns of a key reading network, even prior to schooling, okay, within the first few months of kindergarten. But these differences in white matter connectivity are not some sort of like a lifelong sentence, okay? We know that education shapes brain development. We know that the reading network is experientially driven. And so in this one study, children with dyslexia completed 160 hours of intensive daily one-on-one phonics instruction. So this is 4 hours a day for 8 weeks. And in the study, they found that those two white matter pathways I showed you before, the left arcuate fasciculus and the left ILF, those white matter pathways, there was increase in fractional anisotropy. So there was increase, there was a decrease, basically, there was increase in insulation of those pathways with reading intervention. So the children not only gained behaviorally, not only did they have better reading skills at the end of this intervention, but the white matter pathways also were much better and had showed much greater connectivity. Okay, so the education, so teachers in the classrooms are literally like constructing the reading networks through their education. They're building it in the child. So just my final note, and I know I think I'm running a long time, so I'll be really, really quick with this one. Again, thinking about reading comprehension as sort of this ultimate goal, what does it look like in individuals with dyslexia? And so here we looked at how the different components of reading comprehension interact developmentally in typical readers. And basically what we see is, in first grade, your reading comprehension performance primarily explained or accounted for by your word identification skills here in orange. But as early as second grade, there's sort of a switch. And then, you become more fluent reader and your reading comprehension performance is no longer accounted by your word identification skills as much, but really mostly explained by your language comprehension skills. So now you can read well, and whether or not you comprehend the passage may depend on your background knowledge, your vocabulary, all the different things that go into language comprehension. And in adults, it continue to be the same. So most of your performance in reading comprehension is explained by your language comprehension skills. Sorry, I just jumped a slide. But when we look at the individuals with dyslexia, what we find is that both in first grade and in second grade, and again in adulthood, the reading comprehension performance continued to be explained by their word level skills. So basically, the reading comprehension continues to be constrained by their ability to identify and read single words, with language comprehension becoming increasingly, contributing to reading comprehension. But again, the reading comprehension is constrained. So there's reading comprehension cannot be, you can't bypass their decoding skills nor improve their reading comprehension. And when we look at the brains of adults as they were reading and comprehending a passage, we found, and again, I'm jumping ahead here just because of time, but feel free to ask me about the study, in their Q&A. What we found is that, the different brain regions that are associated with language and cognitive abilities, such as, again, attention and working memory, explained reading comprehension performance in typical reading adults, but were really allocated to support word identification in adults with dyslexia. So this suggests that those cognitive resources and language resources are not available to support reading comprehension in adults with dyslexia. And in fact, they are directed towards word reading. So you can't really comprehend what you read if you can't read the words, and you can't bypass word decoding skills to support reading comprehension. So now I'm going to ask Steven to quickly jump back on, just for a minute. And I'm going to ask Steven, what is this sound?
Was that the G?
This was actually the D. And what is this?
A tufa.
A tufa. So this just to show again how much easier it is for us to learn the meaning of an object than it is to learn the letter and sound associations. And so take-home messages in my talk is that language emerges naturally, but reading development takes explicit training and is really sort of it takes us having to plug this visual system into our language system, like clearly change the brain during those first few years of learning to read. That everyone uses the same brain circuit to learn how to read. So we all use the same brain circuit. There's no alternative ways of bypassing this having to plug in our visual word form area into the language system. And individuals with dyslexia have differences in the circuit, even prior to reading instruction. So the first few months of kindergarten, their brains are already different. And finally, the decoding skills constrain reading comprehension in poor readers. So decoding skills should be targeted in interventions. We can't bypass teaching children the alphabetic code. We can't go around this. We have to do this. So thank you very much. I'm happy to answer a lot of questions during the Q&A. And you can also email me if you have any questions or thoughts.
Thank you so much, Ola, for that wonderful presentation. And we are now going to hear from Miriam, who is a practitioner in the field working with children, and will be sharing.
Sorry, just a technical. I seem to not be able to share my screen.
To share your screen.
Yeah, host disabled share.
Okay.
Let me try again. Oh, that's strange. Host disabled participant screen sharing.
Okay. Let's see. Steven,
I'm working on it.
Okay.
So if you want to give the introduction, let's see if I could fix it in the meantime. If someone knows how to fix it, if they could just put it in the QA, I'll follow your instructions.
It might have something to do with when Ola clicked off.
When she stopped sharing, yeah. Well, okay. Well, as we figure it out. Hi everyone. Thank you, Ola. That was amazing. You see, teachers are brain surgeons or some way teachers are changing brains, literally, quite literally.
Miriam, I think you can do it now. I just changed.
Oh, can I do it? Okay.
Hi, at least.
Let's let Dinan introduce you too, Miriam.
Oh, okay. You can.
Yes,
I mean,
I introduced Miriam earlier. I apologize. I introduced both of them. Let's see if it's working, just in the interest of time. Let's see if, but yes, Miriam is a speech and language
Okay.
pathologist and a reading specialist, and she works with children and families, and she's in the trenches. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, awesome. So everyone can see my screen, I hope. And okay, great. So I'm gonna do a lot of piggybacking off of this really fascinating science that Ola presented, to discuss some real world implications. And I'm gonna kind of frame it around some general principles and practices, ones that are both, aligned to what we know about the reading brain, and ones that may be somewhat misaligned, or need some changing, or need some thinking about, and maybe some pitfalls as we try to, as we try to align the teaching with what we know about the reading brain. So the first thing I want to do is just talk a little bit about this idea of, does one size fit all? Yeah, I mean, this is a phrase that we hear a lot. One size doesn't fit all. So we really need a lot of tools in our toolbox. And this relates to, one of Ola's take-home points. I think it was her second take-home point, that, in some sense, one size does fit all, in the sense that everyone uses the same brain circuit to learn how to read. Now, this is kind of counterintuitive, because we often say this in the negative, one size doesn't fit all. But in the sense that it's the same brain and the same circuit, then it does. And now, this comes up often. Other reading scientists have made this point. It's not really true that we have multiple ways to read. We really have the same brain that imposes the same constraints. Mark Seidenberg, another reading scientist, the answer is really the same. Circumstances differ, people differ, but what we need to learn doesn't change. And this is really it's true whether we're talking about kids who are at risk for dyslexia, who the task may be, much harder for them, or kids who have already been, identified as having dyslexia. It's true for poor kids and rich kids and kids of all racial backgrounds. The brain's human brain is the same. The sort of optimized circuit is the same. And that's something that it's really worth keeping in mind. But does one size fit all in a lot of other senses? Well, no, obviously, there are differences. There are many differences, not only, personalities and interests and attention, and how kids approach challenging tasks, and how easy or hard it is, as we know, as Ola, explained about, on the first day of kindergarten, you have kids walking in who are kind of primed to have this task be easier, and primed to have this task be much harder for them. So the important thing to consider, though, is that the differences really are not qualitative, because again, it's the same circuit that needs to develop. The differences are much more quantitative. So some children will need instruction to be even more explicit, even more teacher directed. They'll need more practice, and they'll need more feedback. So it's kind of more, not a qualitative difference. They all need to connect the visual with the language through that circuit, developing that circuit. So do we need multiple programs and multiple approaches? Well, we certainly have different publishers selling different kind of, programs and approaches, and some might be more helpful for kids at different stages, of course. But it's really worth remembering, I think, that we have to rely on the same basic understanding of what it takes to build that reading brain, and then use, the best methods and instructional techniques that we have. And adapt it to the individual needs of our students, but essentially it's the same. Okay, and the other thing just to note here is that if we certainly we can screen, and we should screen, as Ola described, to see who is at risk for having this be a very difficult task, but it's kind of a very prudent and I think ethical thing to do is just to assume that everyone's going to need very explicit instruction. And then you can kind of see, you can see who needs more pretty quickly if the core instruction takes into account all these principles. Okay, so Ola also shared this multiplicative equation of what reading comprehension, which is the ultimate outcome, and what that is really composed of, these two components. So this is also known as the simple view of reading, and it's really been it's been validated over decades as being incredibly accurate at predicting how well somebody will comprehend a text. And one thing I want to say about this model is that first of all, it does not say that reading is simple. We know that it's clearly reading is one of the most complex things that we do with our brains. So it doesn't say that reading is simple. It doesn't really say anything about the process of reading, or it doesn't say anything about how we get this word recognition piece or how we get this language comprehension piece. But it does say that these are two broad sort of immediate components that are going to impact reading comprehension. And they are, even though, as Ola explained, they're somewhat reciprocal, they're also quite independent in some ways, right? Like it is possible to understand a lot if somebody reads it to you and really not be able to read the words on the page. That's something that's been demonstrated in many ways with other languages. If you can decode a language but you don't understand it, or other ways. So they are kind of partially independent, and these this view of reading is actually very practical. I think it's incredibly useful and practical for parents and teachers in understanding children's reading skills. And I think that we can use this model actually to look at a child, and we can say, well, is this child able to read the words accurately and effortlessly? In which case the word reading would be somewhere here, or is this child able to comprehend the language? So if I read it to them, can they understand it? Okay, well then their language comprehension is strong. And if a child falls into whatever, like if they're starting to, the whole process of learning to read and they have very strong comprehension, they could understand a picture book if you read all the words, complex language in those picture books actually. So their language comprehension is strong in this top left quadrant, but their word recognition is hardly anything. It's zero because they haven't learned to match those squiggles on the page with the sounds. So we can take this grid and we can really ask ourselves, where does this student or this child fall with regards to the continuum of language comprehension skills or knowledge, vocabulary, and their ability to get those words off the page accurately and efficiently. So this is a very helpful and useful and practical model. And I would argue that it should be kind of at the forefront anytime we're discussing children's reading skills, their progress. I think it's just a very useful way to think about where they're at and what they need from us. Often when we discuss children's reading skills and the development, we are making reference to certain reading levels and using the term grade level. So I wanted to just talk about that for a minute. So the very popular kind of A to Z, you'll often hear, well, he's reading at an I or a J or an M. Those levels are not actually aligned with any scientific principle or evidence of how children learn to read. So I would argue they're actually not that helpful in guiding, guiding teachers or, helping parents understand their skills. I would argue that looking at those quadrants and seeing where students are at is a much more helpful way to understand. Now, grade level is actually entirely subjective. That's not, it's not scientific either. But I think grade level is very, very helpful because, grade level is what the community, what our school, what our district, what our, nation has decided we want, students to be able to do in terms of literacy at a certain point so that they can go on and learn and benefit from their schooling and contribute to society and everything. So, grade level, I think, is a helpful, helpful thing to talk about and to identify, but we do have to remember that it is subjective too. So I think the simple view, again, is just a really helpful guide. You can use it with different assessment measures that will look at the two components in different ways. And, you want to use assessments that have some good reliability and some predictive value. So you can see, well, if they're reading, let's say 60 words per minute correctly, at the end of first grade, we can predict that they're sort of on their way. Okay. So that is one thing. So the other principle that Ola discussed that I want to touch on is, when she talked about how we need explicit teaching, how our brains have not, evolved to read. With, tufa was very easy to learn. The exact correspondences of those letters in that made-up alphabet were very hard, or at least harder to learn. So it's I think helpful to think of it as, there's a psychologist, David Geary, who writes about this as skills that are biologically primary and skills that are biologically secondary. And we talk a lot about play and the importance of play in the early grades. So it helps to remember that we have been designed, or whatever, we have evolved, I guess I should say. We are evolved to learn a lot of skills through play, and play is crucial, just critical for learning oral language, for social interaction and learning about our social cues, for our physical world and environment. Those things can be learned through play, and should be learned through play, and we should have time for play in school. But for the biologically secondary skills, like kind of straight up math and science, and those phonemic, like sound manipulation skills and reading and writing, we really, they're best learned with explicit direct teaching. It's not that kids can't learn anything about those things through playing, but it's really not the most efficient and effective way to learn. So, we have to really think about equity here too, because, kids who are already sort of at a little bit of an advantage might pick up things more implicitly. But the kids who aren't are even more dependent on that explicit teaching. So we need to think about that. So what is it that we really need to learn explicitly? Well, those smallest itty bitty sounds, those phonemes, those are what we have to match up with the letters. That's the way our English writing system works. And even though the phonology and like learning the sounds of our language as part of our oral language, the ability to really manipulate, like separate out those sounds, those smallest sounds, is not really a part of natural language development. We perceive them in our language, but we don't separate them out in the speech stream. This is like a picture of a speech stream, and they all kind of blend into each other, and they're really more like abstract units. The researcher Mark Seidenberg likes to say that letters are, like beads on a string, while phonemes, sounds, are not at all. Like they can be different in different words and contexts. They all kind of smush together. So kids really need to be able to pull those words apart into sounds and manipulate them and segment them and blend them. And cutting to the chase with instruction is really important. So this is like a kind of a pitfall, because there are a lot of programs that work on more like the bigger units of phonological awareness, of like clapping syllables, rhyming words, and all of that is great for language development. It can be really fun in preschool. If a child really has difficulty with that stuff, it could be a sign that maybe they're just not as attuned to language. So that's why it shows up on the screeners. But it's really those phonemes that kids need to be able to work with. And so in kindergarten and first grade, I would argue that's where the emphasis should be on those phonemes. And because it's reciprocal with the letters, it should be integrated, I would say, within the same lesson with the letter instruction. So not like we do some oral work, in one part of the day or one day, and then we do our phonics separately. I would say integrate that ability to break up a word into its sounds, match it with the letters in instruction, if you're going to get more bang for your buck and build those pathways. And like, it's like, asking like, well, do we want to make it harder, or do we want to make it easier? So it can be harder for some kids to connect what happens, in one activity where they're just, they're saying, stream, but not looking at the letters, versus what's happening in another activity where they're looking at the letters, but they're not connecting that breaking up of words into its sounds needs to immediately get connected with the letters. So some kids will make that leap and others won't. So to make it easier, connect them. Okay. So this is somebody in England who wrote a great piece. She's a teacher, and she said, imagine that this is what, you're a beginning reader, and basically, you're told, okay, I'm going to teach you to read. Some words you're going to decode, you're going to sound out. Some words you're going to read by memorizing, and you can't really necessarily know which group they're in right when you see the word. So you might have to just kind of figure out what strategy to use. And now, I don't think any teacher would tell a child this, but basically what ends up happening is when we teach words in different categories, like, they're called sight words sometimes, or red words, or trick words, or star words, or remember words, they're called different things. But when we put kind of the words in a different category and say, well, these you just have to remember, and involve kids in activities that involve, memorizing these words or working with them without analyzing their sounds and spellings, it can be quite confusing for kids. It's definitely a pitfall to consider. Now, one of the reasons why we get kind of into this bind is because English is really complex. The English writing system, we have more than one way to spell a sound. We have overlap with one spelling and multiple sounds. We have like 44-ish of these phonemes and about, I don't know, roughly 170, 180 like common ways to spell them. So it's very complicated, but it's still, we need to be able to teach these words in a way that kids are not going to put them into a different sort of, I got to just remember this, because our memories are limited. We have to match up those sounds with the individual spellings in order to really get that system primed and pumped. So to avoid this, we can make sure that the phonics teaching is really thorough and that it kind of moves quickly enough so kids get what they need. We can sort of drip feed some of these necessary words that, with the unusual correspondences, but in a limited way. And, always teaching them with reference to the sound and spelling, and having a strategy for, incidental as well as like systematic teaching of certain patterns. But then we can also say, well, the word stream, but then you see a word like bread. Well, in this word, yes, EA spells the sound. I haven't taught you that yet. So, you're still making reference to the individual sounds and the spellings, even if that you haven't taught that explicitly yet. It keeps the logic. It maintains the logic of the system for the child. Okay, so this is, keeping all that in mind. This is a Australian speech and language pathologist who has a terrific way with words, and she calls this the sweaty sounding out stage that builds the reading muscles. And this is really important because I think sometimes teachers and adults, we don't want kids to be uncomfortable and it sounds like they're really kind of uncomfortable. I mean, for some kids it's not very sweaty at all, obviously. It's like maybe you see a few beads of sweat and then they're off and running. For other kids it's sweatier, and for some it's pretty laborious, but that's where the magic happens. That's where the muscles get built. So she writes, and I know we're running, I really want to leave room for questions, but she really explains it very well. She says, they grunt and groan and sweat their way through the words, and most of the cognitive horsepower gets used up just extracting the words from the page. And they don't understand much of what they read, certainly not fluent. It looks and sounds more like a hard slog. However, inside a child's brain, something extraordinary is happening. They're creating a new brain circuit, linking the visual areas at the back of the brain with the language areas on the left, shifting some tasks done on the left to the right and repurposing the left. So they're building that reading brain through that process, and we really need to embrace it. Many teachers, they might not be comfortable with it, or sometimes I think there's this, idea out there that we don't want them to over focus on the words because then they're not making meaning. We don't want them to be word callers, is a term that comes up, they're just saying the word and they're not focused on the meaning. But we really shouldn't be too nervous about that, because, when a child is laboriously sounding out, that's the stage they're at. I mean, that's critical for them. And as they, do it more and through practice, and different kids need different amounts of practice, that's when they develop that automatic word recognition. And then it's not such a bottleneck, and then they have more mental energy. Doesn't mean you don't reference meaning too, or you go back and reread the sentence together, or have them reread the sentence after they've spent time, decoding it. But when you're watching a child slowly and laboriously sound out words, they're really building their reading brain at that point. So it's really, really important. So with that in mind, okay, sorry, I don't have time. So quickly look at some beginning reading books. These are books that are meant for really early readers, kindergarten. So you can see that some of these words like peppers or squash, could be pretty tricky to sound out. I mean, peppers is a long word, 2 syllables. Squash has that QU and the ah, A says ah. But, they may not really need to go through that sweaty sounding out stage, because the pictures are very helpful here. And it's a very predictable pattern. And, on the next page, if it says, I have, green beans, they're going to be able to read that whether or not they know that EA says E. This is, similar, meant for very beginning reader, a word like caution, obviously they can't sound up, but it's going to repeat. So, reading, here's another one. Orson has a big bone, Taco has a little bone. The pictures are really helpful, the repeating pattern. So a child can read these books and not necessarily sound so sweaty because they have so many other ways to read it. So they can kind of almost like sound more fluent, like fake fluency by memorizing these stems and by, looking at the pictures. So it's a lot easier to listen to a child sometimes read a book like this. But if they're not really attending to the word and going through that sounding out of the word, they're not making that word into, an automatic word that they'll recognize necessarily the next time they see it. And they're not building that circuit that really needs to be built. So these are some other books that are also kind of purposely written for young, beginning readers. And you can see this one, has kind of simple patterns. Mom had to get fish. You'd have to sound out the word fish. You wouldn't know from the picture they're getting fish. Here's another one with more engaging pictures that has very simple patterns that the child has already kind of learned, and they can really work to sound out rubs and put it together, and then obviously talk about what's happening in the picture, but the picture isn't really helping with the words. And here's another one. And ideally these books are kind of cumulative, so everything that they've learned before they'll see again, but this one focuses on the ow sound and the OU and the OW way to spell ow. So these are often called decodable books because they are meant to really encourage that decoding strategy and build those skills. I think, some kids, once they are sort of off and running with decoding, they'll apply that to whatever book you're giving them. So, once you can decode, any book is decodable, basically. But, so I prefer sometimes to call them phonically controlled because they're just more controlled with the phonics in mind. And this is just a quote to say that, that the text choice does really matter for young children because it often determines kind of the cues that they have to use. So it kind of teaches them like, well, what is this reading thing? What am I supposed to do here? Am I supposed to, sound everything out, or am I supposed to look for other ways to get those words? Okay, so, oops, hold on. Okay, so this is what I just wanted to, oh my gosh, time. So I want to quickly just, show you that, those types of texts that are more predictable, those also encourage other kinds of prompting. This sort of like, you're trying to see if it looks right or if it makes sense, or if you can see any little words inside the big words, or looking at the picture. And like the level literacy intervention program guide says that, you want readers to have many ways to solve and analyze words, and they can kind of pick and choose different strategies. And that is, that sounds appealing because it's great to have lots of tools in your toolbox, but it really is based on a flawed assumption that word reading is kind of a problem-solving activity when, as Ola explained, how automatically and instantly and quickly these words get recognized, that it's really more like a reflex. And the goal of instruction is to kind of develop that reflex as efficiently as possible so that they can move on to all the many other aspects, so that it's not a bottleneck for all that comprehension. So what kind of practice do they need? Well, they do need a lot of practice and feedback, and some need more than others, of course. And some children may benefit fairly early on from independent reading if they're, starting to really to decode and do some, kind of self-teaching is what it's called sometimes. But others won't. And so we have to be really careful with independent reading, because if we know children are struggling with that and we let them read independently a lot, that time is not time necessarily well spent for them. It could be just an exercise in frustration. It could be embedding, actually, skipping words and guessing words and embedding those habits. So we have to really think about ways that we can get early readers the kind of immediate feedback and opportunity to read aloud and develop those reading muscles. So that is that. And then last, but very much not least, reading comprehension, we have to remember, it's not a skill. Remember, it's that outcome of both of those components working together. It's a process to comprehend a text when those, components are really strong, and it's not a single thing. So when we assess reading comprehension, there's all kinds of pitfalls to be aware of. The 5 different assessments of reading comprehension, a child can do perform very differently because there's so many things underlying it. And teaching it as a kind of generic skill. You can teach certain, strategies and ways to approach a text, but teaching, find the main idea or infer in a general way, or, determine the author's purpose, is also full of pitfalls, because you have to look at those components. So again, the simple view of reading can help us avoid those pitfalls by really looking at what we need to teach. Do we need to teach the vocabulary, the knowledge that this child needs to read this? Do we need to teach them to get the words off the page efficiently? Both. And focus on teaching both of those things. So it's not really, about balance exactly. It's about teaching what's needed at the different stages for the different kids. And then we can guide them through the process of reading and understanding, discussing great books once we do that. Okay, so I think that is just about it. So I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Miriam, for that wonderful presentation. So thank you both to Ola and Miriam. I know that we ran a little over with our presentations, and I apologize about that, but we really want to give some time for Q&A because this is such an important part of this webinar. So Ola, I'm going to start with a question for you, which was, based on what we know about early screening, what assessments do you think need to be in place in Brookline to identify very young, kindergartners, young children who might be at risk for dyslexia? So what would be like, and this would be a screening for all kids, what components do you think need to be in there?
Right, so this is a great question. So as I mentioned, so basically phonological awareness, phonological memory, those we know are, the very reliable predictors of reading outcomes. And those are actually pretty reliable throughout the years. Letter knowledge is another reliable predictor that's most reliable very early in kindergarten and sort of loses its reliability later on as most children become fluent in letter identification. Rapid automatized naming is something that we may not be able to intervene on immediately in kindergarten, but could actually help us sort of predict which children may develop fluency deficits when they, sort of conquer the identification of words. They still might be a little bit slower. And we also know that children, as I showed in my profile findings, the children who have a deficit in both the phonological system and the rapid automatized naming system tend to be the kiddos who show the profile of having dyslexia later on. And finally, oral language is another really important component that's important to assess, because then it would allow us to distinguish children who could have, for example, developmental language disability, so have deficits in oral language that can co-occur with reading difficulties or could be independent from reading difficulties. So it's another important measure to assess early in kindergarten.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to ask a clarification question, because I know we use these terms, but they're not used sort of in our general day-to-day. When you say rapid automatized naming, can you just briefly explain for parents, like, what does that mean?
Sure. So basically showing, for example, you show a card on a paper, and that card has colors that repeating in different, like 5 different colors that repeat on the page across the rows in different combinations. And the child's task is basically to name these colors as quickly as they can. And so it turns out that an assessment like that, it could be done with colors or objects or letters, is actually really reliable sort of a correlate of fluency later on. And some even call it like it's like it represents a microcircuit that involves in reading. So, you identify visual stimuli on the page, you retrieve the name of that stimuli, you articulate, right? And you do it very quickly. So you basically go through sort of the reading circuit as you perform that action. You retrieve the phonological code for that stimuli. So, so Sam and Marianne Wolf, who is like one of the sort of the first people who developed the theory of double deficit theory of dyslexia using the rapid naming stimuli, suggested that this is sort of a microcircuit of reading that's available very early on in kindergarten.
Thank you. That's super helpful. We have a lot of questions trying to touch on the salient points. One of the questions that also, Ola, this is going to be a question for you, and then Miriam, I have one for you. One of the questions is, so we have a lot of students in Brookline who are bilingual. And one of the questions that came up was regarding the development of reading. You talked about how we reading has to be explicitly taught and what happens in the brain. When a child is bilingual, so let's say you speak English and Mandarin. Mandarin is more of a pictorial form of language. Is it the same processes in language, or is it completely different?
It's actually a fascinating question, and most of the studies in the brain still have been conducted in English, but the few studies that were done in Chinese show that we predominantly children who read in Chinese orthography activate a very similar brain network. So they still involve that visual word forming area, the same phonological system as they read, with the exception of they tend to recruit the right hemispheric. All I talked about the brain, the network, I really showed you sort of the left hemisphere, which is where we sort of think that predominantly the reading network is involved. But children who read in Chinese also sort of recruit the right hemispheric reading network. And this is really fascinating because we know that, Chinese is very visually challenging to read. The orthography is so intricate that sort of like just the left hemispheric visual system, it just doesn't suffice. You need to recruit additional resources from the right, which is not the case, for example, in English. What we also tend to see behaviorally in children who are, read in Chinese versus children who read in English, in terms of which deficits they show in dyslexia, is that they also tend to show poor phonological performance, but their deficits, predominantly tend to be in fluency versus phonology. So they, both in Chinese as well as the more orthographically shallow languages such as German, the phonological deficits are still there early on, but they tend to sort of switch to become fluency deficits. Unlike in English, because the orthography is so deep, the phonological deficit is the predominant one. So I hope it makes sense. But the phonological system is very similar. Brain networks are involved in reading across the different orthographies, in fact.
Thank you. That was very helpful. So, Miriam, I have a question for you, and this is sort of a more broad picture question. I don't know if Steven wants to chime in too, but one of the questions is, so with regards to what we're doing in Brookline in terms of reading instruction, there's some good things happening, and what came up in the talks was that there's some areas where, we could improve. Miriam, I was curious about, your thoughts with regards to, what could Brookline focus on? And I know that's a broad question, but for example, if you were to look at the texts that kids are given to read, you talked quite a bit about the sort of non-decodable text versus decodable text.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is, that is definitely something that that would be wonderful to get. And I have heard there are more. I think there have been some grants there. I think teachers are really trying to get those texts in their classrooms because they can see how it impacts the strategies that young very early readers use. So I think decodable texts are great. I mean, we don't have we don't have studies that separate out the, decodable text, use of decodable text versus just the explicit phonics instruction. But clearly we do know that that children are more likely to use a decoding strategy when using texts that are not designed in order to, to have them use other strategies. So decodable text would be really important, I think. And, I think, it would help teachers also prompt children in helpful ways. I think, phonics instruction that is, that moves at a good pace so that kids, can connect that to what they're reading, pretty quickly. I think assessment is really important to be able to assess, not according to some kind of, A to Z type of, level, but to actually, find an assessment that is, which I think is, part of the efforts to find screening assessments, but even later in elementary school, an assessment that like what they call oral reading fluency, which is just a kind of a 1 minute, oral reading passage, and you can look at the percent accuracy and how many words correct per minute, and it's just a very predictive measure. So if children could be assessed that way, it's also less time consuming for teachers. And then they could really kind of target their resources. So, for the kids who are doing really well on those measures and reaching the benchmarks, they can focus resources, elsewhere in their comprehension and their vocabulary and the knowledge. And, for the children who are kind of flagged on those assessments, they can really look deeper to see where, the difficulty is, and to probe into their phonics and decoding skills, to probe into their attention, all of that. So it would be a much more efficient, I think, way of assessing kids, and more accurate. So that's something I think would be great if Brookline could move towards that. And just, yeah, I mean, there's other things too, but yeah, that's.
Yeah.
Can I tack on to that?
Yes.
So I thought these presentations were fantastic. And my top level takeaway is that the science of reading is very well established. And in fact, it's very deep as well. So there's no reason for any of our literacy instruction, our tools, our resources, our pedagogies, our ideas, our concepts, there's no reason for it not to be grounded in robust evidence bases, because they exist and they're continually being refined. As a school committee member, that's my takeaway. I mean, I hear from the specific things like our language instruction at the early primary grades needs to be explicit and phonics based, but more broadly, we're making major investments in our literacy content and curriculum continually. We're continuing to purchase content and curriculum from specific sources, and it's incumbent upon us to make sure that those purchases are providing the kinds of instructional experiences for kids that we know are going to have results, because literacy is one of those areas that you can find those results. Those results are measurable. So I guess I just wanted to draw, for me, that's the application of a lot of this, of the presentations that Miriam and Ola gave, is that we need to be making sure that our classroom materials, content, resources, et cetera, that's all aligned with what Ola and Miriam are discussing. And the areas where they're not, we need to be examining them closely. We need to be figuring out what benefits are they providing? Are there benefits? Are there harms? So I just wanted to add on to that in response to your questions,
Thank you, Steven, for your input. And I think that one of the questions that came up, which I think which hits on what you just said, was a comment that was made was, so let's say we're screening the children, hopefully at young, right, when they're in kindergarten, not when they get to third grade, and the child's struggling. That's where third grade is as we know, is a big area where a lot of students, when it goes from learning to read to reading to learn, a lot of students come up as red flags. So the idea of the early screening, how important that is. And one of the parents asked, so let's say you do the early screening, or let's say we're already doing some early screening and you have 10 kids who are at risk, but the financial resources that we have, only allow for 3 of those kids, 3 out of the 10, to get support. And now I'm being very simplistic, or the question was, I think, trying to be framed to kind of get a message across, which is like, what happens to the 7 other kids? And I think that to your point, Miriam, and to what Steven's saying, is that the idea is that good instruction, if you have good instruction from the get-go, and there's a lot of good instruction going on in Brookline. I just want to note that, like, I think the foundations is great, but it's that next step of application, right? So, the phonics and the work, and then application to connected text, giving the kids text that they can actually apply their decoding skills, which is a part of, the improvement to instruction, which I think is something that we could see. And in terms of answering, I'm sort of answering the question, but I'm thinking that those 10 kids, who are struggling, I mean, if there's good instruction, and there is a lot, these classroom teachers are working so hard, and there's so much wonderful things. So I don't want teachers to this isn't about you're not doing a good job. I think this is more like a step back, a pedagogical look at what are we doing in the classroom, and that good instruction serves all kids. All kids benefit. And there might be kids that need extra, right? Whether it's like, tier 2 or tier 3. But I think starting with good instruction at the base, that eliminates a lot of, it's very cost saving. It is cost saving. I mean, there's a budget piece to this. So I just want to.
Dinan, can I just piggyback on that, and then I'll just clear for the rest. I think that's exactly right. I think point number 1, all students that need the extra services need to get the extra services, period. That's our legal, ethical, moral obligation. And if we get the reading instructional piece right, we should have fewer kids to refer. I just want to add on to this. This isn't just an early primary issue. After the last subcommittee meeting on curriculum, I was contacted by some middle school teachers who wanted to talk about how our literacy instructional purchases affect them. And it really didn't really dawn on me. I guess I thought that it sort of ended at some point. Once kids were reading, it didn't really impact grades 6, 7, 8, 9. But I learned that for some of our purchases, like Lucy Calkins's units of writing and units of reading, are actually prescribing scope and sequence for 6th, 7th, 8th grade. So these are purchases these are investments that we're making as a district that go beyond the foundation we're building for kids to be able to read. It goes all throughout. It goes K through 8. So that's why this important. That's why I'm trying to take out of this, from in my mind, the importance of this being of our purchases being evidence-based, and what those purchases would look like if they were evidence-based. Okay, goodbye. Ola, back to you.
I just wanted to add to this. I mean, those 10 kids are not going anywhere, right? So if we're identifying them in kindergarten versus like in 5th grade or 6th grade, we know that the interventions are going to be much more effective with these kiddos than down the stream, right? Because in 6th grade, we have to intervene not just with reading, which is going to take us much longer, much more, we have to invest many more resources into helping these children in 5th grade than we do in kindergarten. This is what the literature shows, that we get much more for our buck if we're intervening early on. But we also then have to help them with like the social studies content that they're missed, and the math that they're struggling with because they have difficulties reading the math problems, right? So basically, the resources we will need to supply to, give adequate instruction for these children. Like Steven said, we can't like not give it to them. This is their right to get this instruction. We just would need to have many more resources directed towards that later on. And if we do it in kindergarten, and this is the case for, we have a lot in the Congress, we have discussions about this, about early intervention, right? We just know that the early brains are more plastic, more susceptible to change. And so let's just, do preventative science versus, really helping the thing, down the stream when it's already much more serious. And then my second point that somebody raised about, how many false positives we have, and it's all about where we draw the line, right? This is where we decide which child is at risk or not at risk. We could be liberal with that line, and we can say, I prefer to over-identify children as having risk because, worst case scenarios, they get a little bit more instruction, a little bit more of like teacher time, than missing out on kids who then, we miss out on them, and they're going to be those kiddos who sit in kindergarten and first grade and second grade, and really suffer because it has a lot of social emotional consequences as well when you're failing to learn how to read, right? And so it all depends where we draw our categorical line between risk or no risk. Or we could just throw away this line and we could instead just focus on those profiles of children, right? If we see that the child is having difficulties with letter knowledge, we can intervene there. If they have a phonological deficit, we can intervene there. At the very least, we can just keep an extra eye on them throughout the year when they're sitting in our kindergarten classroom learning to read. So I think it's a really valid question about false positives, but again, it's all about where we draw the line in determining risk. So we decide what the false positive rate we're willing to accept when we screen our children.
Thank you, Ola. So I'm looking at the time, and I'm gonna ask. We do have more questions, but I wanted to, Lauren, who are our president. Do you have? Should we sort of wrap it up, or do we have time for one more?
Let's take one more question.
Okay. So this is a question actually for Miriam. This is a parent who said, who was asking, what happens when you have a student who has good grades, and so they're managing and they have good grades, but they're reading everything as sight words. So their phonological awareness is actually really poor, and they're managing, so they're not getting, they're not being flagged. But is that going to catch up with a student at some point? The question is like, is there, because the school, it's a parent who's saying, the school's saying, well, the kid's fine, they're getting good grades. So, but the parent sees that the phonological awareness is very poor.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I would argue that the grades are not always don't have always a direct relationship with the actual skill level. There's all kinds of factors that go into a student's success in terms of a grade received in a class. That student might be working, about 100 times harder than they need to be for that good grade. They might have other, other strengths that can kind of carry them along and help them achieve a good grade. But the grade isn't necessarily a direct reflection on their skill level or what they're necessarily learning, if they're learning as much as they could be or should be. So I would definitely look underneath and see, because, also eventually they will, have to read all kinds of things in their life beyond the class that they might be in, that they're receiving a good grade in. And if those underlying skills are not, not where we want them to be, then that should be addressed. So, I don't think the grades don't necessarily correspond.
Yeah,
I guess that's
Thank
what
you.
I'm saying.
And of course, I have something to add. Your question. Sorry, I'll be really brief. But back to sort of the study that I showed, that how many cognitive resources individuals who have reading difficulties have to sort of deploy to support word identification during reading of passage. So it is, of course, possible, that they're doing really well and they're able to perform. But in terms of like that catching up to them, they have to really, like, those resources are going somewhere, right? And so instead of supporting comprehension and maybe at the higher level, or maybe, them thinking about ideas in a deeper way, those resources could be deployed for them to try to remember the words and identify them by sight. So I think, it's all about like, they're performing and they're compensating, but are they taking the resources away from something else? So they could be doing even better. right? If they have such a
Yes.
potential.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Ola. Lauren, I'm going to hand it back to you to sort of, round us off.
Sure. So I want to say something really quick to that last question, because that's actually how I got interested in the science of reading and dyslexia. I was a college freshman. I was in a volunteer tutoring program a while ago. I'm not going to give away my age, but it was a while ago. And I was asked to tutor a 5th grader in reading. And she was being asked to read Shakespeare, like early Shakespeare, very early, like Romeo and Juliet, a little bit watered down, but still Shakespeare. And I was helping her, and I realized she couldn't read. And she had gotten this far, 5th grade, with, kind of B's and C's, because she was so good at memorizing words, sight words. And then all of a sudden she's asked to read Shakespeare, and that was the aha moment. She couldn't read. So that was sort of my beginning of my interest in this subject. And I also want to say thank you to everyone who attended, and say a word that Ben Kelly was unable to be here, but he has tremendous interest in this subject, and he has worked tirelessly to bring this particular event and other events like the Emily Hannaford event and some other events that we've had about reading and others to come. It is a real passion of his as well. Thank you to everyone who's attended. Thank you so much to our panelists and speakers. Thank you to Steven Ehrenberg for taking yet another couple of hours on a night that he should be with his family, because school committee is such an enormous commitment. So we're grateful that he gave us some of his time as well. Thank you to Dinan for doing such a great job with the Q&A and distilling all of those questions. Everyone who's been here will be sent the recording of this event, and you will also find it in a few days on our website, brooklineparents.org. Please feel free to contact us with any other questions. We tried to get to as many questions as we could in the chat. Invariably, we can't get to all of them, but we hope you enjoyed this event. We hope there was a lot to learn. There's a lot of information in there. And if anyone wants to be able to connect with our panelists and speakers, please write us at the Brookline Parents Organization, and we will put you in touch. Thank you. Have a great evening, and stay safe. Bye-bye. Have a happy holiday season, especially Happy New Year to everyone. Bye-bye.